Hello all you YouTubers out there, this is Victoria with part 2 of my Sabbath video, and this is video number 2 of part 2. Okay, we're going to continue on with Romans 14. I've got my stopwatch right here next to me, so I won't go over 10 minutes. Romans 14, this is the claim. Romans 14 says not to judge one another in the matter of observing days. Therefore, we don't have to keep the Sabbath. And here's the passage it is based on, is Romans 14 verses 1 through 6. Now accept the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinions. One person has faith that he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats vegetables only. The one who eats is not to regard with contempt the one who does not eat, and the one who does not eat is not to judge the one who eats, for God has accepted him. Who are you to judge the servant of another? To his own master he stands or falls, and he will stand, for the Lord is able to make him stand. One person regards one day above another, another regards every day alike. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it for the Lord, and he who eats does so for the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. And he who eats not for the Lord he does not eat, and gives thanks to God. Verses 1 through 6. I'm sorry, I'm tongue-tied today too. My response. First, I find it quite odd to find a discussion on the Sabbath, as is claimed, in the middle of a discussion on vegetarianism. Being vegetarian is not talked about in the Mosaic Law, so it's even an odder pairing to jump back and forth between non-Mosaic, eating only vegetables, to Mosaic, the Sabbath, and back to non-Mosaic again. It just makes no sense. Judging from the Greek, koinos, that's K-O-I-N-O-S, meaning common in verse 14, versus akathartos, that's A-C-A-T-H-A-R-T-O-S, meaning impure. The discussion is likely over meat that has been sacrificed to idols rather than food that was unclean under Levitical law. Additionally, if it is talking about Sabbath keepers, and Sabbath keepers are weak in verse 1, then Paul himself was weak because he kept the Sabbath. And the references for that are Acts 18 verses 4 and 19, Acts 17 verses 1, 10 and 17, and Acts 20, 16. And we know Paul wasn't weak because in Acts 15:1 he says, "We who are strong." Romans 14 doesn't have to do with observance, non-observance of the law, but of, and this is a quote, "scruples of conscience dictated not by divine precepts, but by human conventions and superstitions." And that is by Samuel Bakioki from his book The Sabbath in the New Testament, pages 118 to 119. So I hope that makes a little sense to you, that it doesn't have to do with the Sabbath at all. Okay. Now, on to the next one. See how my time is going. As soon as it goes back. Okay. Alright. Next claim. 1 Corinthians 16:2 gives us an example of a collection during a Sunday worship service. And this is the verse. "On the first day of every week, each one of you is to put aside and save as he may prosper, so that no collections be made when I come." Paul is telling them to put money aside. This is my response. Paul is telling them to put money aside that day. It mentions nothing about church. It just says to put aside and save so that the person would have the money and not have to scramble to get it when Paul shows up. This verse simply makes no sense as a Sunday proof verse because it simply doesn't say what people try to make it say. Additionally, no Jew would handle money on the Sabbath, and it seems more likely this would have extended to the early church. So when Paul is telling them to handle money on Sunday, it could not be in the context of a worship service. And also it could not be, Sunday could not be the new Sabbath, because they would still be following the Jewish law of not handling money on the Sabbath. Okay. Next claim. Galatians says that we are not to observe days, and this is the passage. However, at that time, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those which by nature are no gods. But now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how is it that you turn back again to the weak and worthless elemental things to which you desire to be enslaved all over again? You observe days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that perhaps I have labored over you in vain. And that's Galatians 4, verses 8 through 11. My response. The Galatians were in danger of going back to paganism. After all, how can they be enslaved all over again if they were not enslaved in the first place? And surely they had not previously been enslaved to the Jewish law. And I'll back up with a quote. I'll put a quote about that below. The Revised Standard Version has an interesting translation of verse 9. But now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and beggarly elemental spirits whose slaves you want to be once more? Elemental spirits here could indeed refer to pagan practices or worshiping other gods. Let me quote Samuel Bakioki, since he is much more the scholar than I. And this is all a quote now. It is generally agreed that the Galatians' observance of sacred times was motivated by superstitious beliefs in astral influences. This is suggested by Paul's charge that their adoption of these practices was tantamount to a return to their former pagan subjection to elemental spirits and demons. Paul's concern was not to expose the superstitious ideas attached to these observances, but rather to challenge the whole system of salvation which the Galatians' false teachers had devised. By conditioning justification and acceptance with God to such things as circumcision and the observance of days and seasons. And that is from his book, The Sabbath in the New Testament, page 122. He goes on to state that this is works-based salvation dependent on quote-unquote human achievement. Galatians 5:4 seems to back up this interpretation. You have been severed from Christ, you who are seeking to be justified by law, you have fallen from grace. So the days here don't have to do with the Sabbath days. It has to do with other special days and pagan practices associated with them that the Galatians wanted to fall back into again. Alrighty. And I'm going to continue on with the world-famous Colossians 2. And that will be a rather lengthy one. It runs just over a page on my notes. So we will continue on with that in video number 3. Thanks. Bye.